Hi everyone, and welcome to this session on the endocrine system. Hopefully you'll have had a chance to think about the endocrine system and what your current knowledge levels are on this subject. So the purpose of the endocrine system is intercellular communication. To maintain homeostasis, the cells and tissues of the body must communicate with each other, providing information about their own activities and instructions for appropriate responses. For rapid and short-lived communication, which would be the timescale of milliseconds to seconds, the synaptic system of the somatic and autonomic nervous systems provides such communication. For slower and longer-lasting communication, which will last minutes to days, chemical messengers, i.e. hormones, are transmitted largely in the circulatory system to the target cells, and this is a more effective process than constant firing of the autonomic and somatic nervous system. Hormones are chemicals which circulate in the bloodstream and spread around the body to carry signals to different parts of the body. The name hormone comes from the Greek word hormeo, meaning excite, and it refers to the fact that each hormone stimulates or excites a particular part of the body known as a target gland or target cell. Hormones are secreted by endocrine glands into the interstitial fluid, and they diffuse into the blood and are distributed throughout the body. They will only affect those cells with specific receptors for that particular hormone. Paracrines are local hormones that transfer information from cell to cell within the same tissue, but they are too diluted within the blood to have an effect on more distant tissues. Endocrine glands are specialized tissues for the production and secretion of hormones. However, many tissues with other functions also contain endocrine glands that release hormones. So this diagram shows the main endocrine glands within the body. Starting in the brain, there's the pineal gland and the pituitary gland. As we move down the body, there's the thyroid gland located around the throat, the thymus, which is around the center of the chest, the adrenal glands, which sit on top of the kidneys, the pancreas, the ovaries in females, and the testes in males. Hormones themselves are made within these endocrine glands and pass from the cells of the gland directly into the blood flowing through the gland. Generally, the higher the amount of hormone that is in the blood, the greater its effects on the target cell. Hormones fall into two groups. Firstly, lipid-soluble, for example steroids, which are made from cholesterol, and thyroid hormones T3 and T4, which are made from iodinated tyrosine. The second group is water-soluble, and these are mostly amino acid derivatives, short peptide chains of full-size proteins. This table from your textbooks shows the general features of the hormone classes. Group 1, steroids, etc., are lipophilic. This means they are fat-soluble. They use transport proteins to transport into the target cell, and they have a long half-life within the plasma. Their receptors are intracellular, and they're mediated by receptor hormone complexes. Group 2 hormones, which are polypeptides, proteins, etc., are hydrophilic. They do not require transport proteins, as their receptors tend to be found in the plasma membrane of the cell. They have a short half-life within the plasma, and their action is mediated by CAMP, CGMP, calcium, or some other form of metabolites within the cell. This diagram shows the action of a lipid-soluble hormone. So we can see that the hormone is transported in the blood on a transport protein. As it reaches the target cell, the lipid-soluble hormone diffuses into the cell. This joins with receptors within the cell to form an activated receptor hormone complex, and it will alter the gene expression of the cell. The newly formed mRNA directs synthesis of specific proteins on ribosomes, and the new proteins alter the cell's activity. In contrast, water-soluble hormones bind to receptors on the cell membrane. This activates a secondary messenger system. ATP is involved in this process, and as a result, enzymes become activated. These activated enzymes catalyze reactions that produce physiological responses. Hormone secretion tends to occur in short bursts with little or no activity in between. Secretion may be stimulated by the nervous system, the presence of a specific chemical in the blood, or by other hormones. Most operate in a negative feedback loop, and in time, circulating hormones are inactivated by the liver and excreted by the kidneys. So the first endocrine gland we will look at is the hypothalamus, and this is the major integrating link between the nervous and endocrine systems. It controls many aspects of body growth and reproduction. It synthesizes a number of hormones which it passes to the pituitary gland. Hypothalamic hormones are either releasing or inhibiting, so they will cause the release of further hormones or act to inhibit others. The pituitary gland is a pea-like inferior extension of the anterior hypothalamus, and it's protected by a fossa in the underlying sphenoid bone of the cranial cavity. It is subdivided into the larger anterior lobe and a smaller posterior lobe. A capillary portal network allows hormones from the hypothalamus to be carried directly to the anterior pituitary without first going through general circulation. These hypothalamic hormones are either releasing or inhibiting hormones, and these have effects on further hormones produced by the anterior pituitary, which then go on to other endocrine glands, for example the gonads, the thyroid, the adrenal cortex, and they initiate hormone synthesis there. The anterior pituitary gland is responsible for the production of the following hormones. The posterior pituitary gland receives hormone molecules directly from the hypothalamus through neurosecretory cells. It stores them until stimulated by the nervous system to secrete these into the blood. An example of this is ADH, antidiuretic hormone, which has an action on the renal system. Also oxytocin, which is involved in control of the reproductive system. This diagram shows the posterior pituitary and the anterior pituitary. Neurons synthesizing trophic hormones release them into the capillaries of the portal system, and these portal vessels carry the trophic hormones directly to the anterior pituitary. Endocrine cells release their hormones into the second set of capillaries for distribution to the rest of the body. Neurosecretory cells contained within the hypothalamus are responsible for secretion of hormones from the posterior pituitary. The thyroid gland is a butterfly-shaped gland just below the larynx, and most of the right and left lobes are filled with thyroid follicles which store the thyroid hormones T4, thyroxine, and T3. Most body cells have receptors for T3 and T4, and these hormones act to increase basal metabolic rate and ATP synthesis. This increases temperature as well as growth. Their synthesis and release is promoted by appropriate hormones from the hypothalamus and the anterior pituitary gland. And this diagram demonstrates this negative feedback loop between the thyroid gland, the hypothalamus, and the anterior pituitary. Synthesis of T3 and T4 is promoted by appropriate hormones from the hypothalamus and the anterior pituitary. These are thyrotropin releasing hormone, TRH, and thyroid stimulating hormone, TSH. These are inhibited by elevated blood levels of T3 and T4 in a simple negative feedback loop. The parathyroid glands are partially embedded in the posterior surface of the thyroid gland and release the parathyroid hormone, PTH, which is a major regulator of the level of inorganic ions within the blood. The adrenal glands lie in the superior surface of each kidney, and they consist of an outer cortex, which occupies most of the volume, and an inner medulla. The adrenal medulla produces epinephrine and norepinephrine. Epinephrine and norepinephrine are identical to the neurotransmitters of the sympathetic nervous system, and when produced endocrinally by the adrenal medulla, they simply prolong the otherwise short-term effect of sympathetic nervous system stimulation. The adrenal cortex produces several steroid hormones, or corticosteroids. The outer zone produces mineralocorticoids, which affect mineral or inorganic homeostasis, especially aldosterone, which controls sodium and potassium uptake by the kidneys.
I'm listening.
The middle zone produces glucocorticoids which affect glucose homeostasis, particularly cortisol, and this has many actions on metabolism. Cortisol promotes protein breakdown, converts amino acids to glucose, stimulates fatty acid breakdown to ATP, and reduces inflammation levels. At high concentration, it will depress the immune response. As with thyroid hormones, its concentration is regulated by a simple negative feedback loop through the hypothalamus and the anterior pituitary gland. The inner zone produces weak androgens in both sexes, but this is especially important in females. Pancreatic islets do not solely have an endocrine function, but large islet areas, known as islets of Langerhans, secrete the hormones glucagon and insulin, and these affect blood glucose levels. Their synthesis is controlled by feedback inhibition directly related to blood glucose level. Insulin also has important promoting effects on protein and fatty acid synthesis. We can see within a healthy pancreas, insulin is released and it binds to a cell membrane insulin receptor. This allows glucose uptake by the cell. Type 1 diabetes is where insulin is not produced by the pancreas. Therefore, there is no uptake of glucose by the cells, and as a result, glucose levels stay high within the blood. In type 2 diabetes, although insulin is produced by the pancreas, for various reasons these may not bind to insulin receptors on the cell membrane, and therefore glucose remains within the blood rather than uptake by the cell. Stresses are an inevitable part of life. Stressful stimuli or stressors may be physical, environmental, biological, or emotional, and homeostatic mechanisms are usually adequate to keep the internal environment within its normal limits despite their influence. If stress is extreme, prolonged, or unusual, it may elicit the stress response, which is a three-stage process of bodily changes. The initial fight or flight response, a slower resistance reaction, and final exhaustion. The fight or flight response, sometimes known as fight, flight, or freeze, is a response initiated by the hypothalamus and conveyed to the body by the sympathetic nervous system. It mobilizes the body's resources for immediate physical activity. The effects include stimulating the adrenal medulla to produce hormones epinephrine and norepinephrine, which will prolong the effect of the sympathetic nervous system. So the endocrine system pumps out epinephrine, norepinephrine, and cortisol. Norepinephrine will constrict the blood vessels. Less growth hormone and fewer sex hormones will be produced. The immune system will be suppressed. The heart will beat faster, thus pumping more blood. Blood pressure will rise, and blood flow will increase to muscles and decrease to organs. The breathing becomes faster and shallower, will consume more oxygen and expel more carbon dioxide. Sweating process may begin, and the pancreas will pump out glucagon, produce less insulin, and blood sugar levels will rise. The resistance reaction is a longer lasting response that's initiated by hypothalamic releasing hormones rather than by nervous activity. The releasing hormones are for cortisol. Releasing hormones are for cortisol from the adrenal cortex, growth hormone and thyroid stimulating hormone, both from the anterior pituitary. All of this will result in increased provision of glucose and fatty acids for ATP synthesis. This will prolong the body's ability to continue fighting the stressor. Exhaustion ensues if body resources cannot sustain the resistance reaction long enough to overcome the stressor. Prolonged exposure to cortisol and other resistance reaction hormones may result in a range of pathologies, and this includes muscle wasting, immune system suppression, failure of the pancreatic insulin secreting cells, ulceration of the gastrointestinal system, and it can ultimately result in chronic disease and premature death. In the next section, we'll be looking at the individual hormones and their actions.